These are the times that try men's souls.
The definitive horror documentary returns to explore the lost decade of horror and join a year-long celebration of early 90s horror with the greatest lineup of 90s horror stars in history. Join Loop and Larry and their six-time returning guest star, writer-director David Weiner, as we go in search of darkness 1990 to 1994. In a world filled with intergalactic space battles, metahuman destruction on a global scale, and psychopathic serial hauntings, there's only one team who can make sense of it all. When your world is overrun with rampant pop culture, call Loop and Larry, Guardians of Geek.
Yes!
Woo! 68, yes. Baby.
I can't believe 68 episodes. Hey, I'm Loop.
And I'm Larry.
This is Guardians of Geek. And we have a very special episode. Normally we do our normal format. We're throwing that out the window because we got a special guest, a returning guest. Larry, tell us who it is.
It wouldn't be the Halloween season, nor would it be a new season of Loop and Larry if we did not have our esteemed guest, writer-director David Weiner, director, writer of In Search of Darkness, In Search of Darkness 2, In Search of Darkness 3, In Search of Tomorrow, In Search of all the other things that you've ever grown up with, In Search of everything that you're searching for, this guy has directed and made a documentary about. Very excited to have him back for his sixth appearance here as In Search of Darkness. 1990 to 1994 is about to kick off, and we want to know all about what the 90s had in the realm of horror, because we know what the 80s did. Now we need to know what the 90s learned from the 80s. So welcome, David.
Thank you very much. First of all, this is not very good for podcasting, but I have to hold this up. This is something that you guys gave me, but unfortunately it's now out of date. Certificate of Outstanding Participation, proudly presented to David Weiner for achieving an unprecedented fifth appearance. And so I got to go get the whiteout now.
Either that, or you have to keep creating documentaries until you can appear 10 times.
10 times the X.
Yeah, at 10 is when you get the robe.
Well, I have no room for the posters of my films because I now have more plaques from Loop and Larry.
That's right.
No, it's always a pleasure to be back with you guys hanging out. And listen, I'll just say off the bat that you guys are the ultimate geeks and the ultimate cool guys who like to sort of spread the word and spread the wealth of fun stuff and nostalgia. And so it's always very, very, very much appreciated because I do come knocking on your door and I'm wondering if I'm like, fish goes bad, after 2-3 days. Happy to have you guys help me yell from my soapbox on the corner.
Absolutely. That's what we're here for. We carry our soapbox around everywhere. Anybody can step up on it and proclaim their geekdom. So
yeah, that's right.
So tell us what you've got on the go.
So the In Search of Darkness trilogy, which was all about 80s horror, it ended up being a 14.5 hour or 14 plus hours. I haven't done the actual minute specifics, but it's 3 movies that are 4.5 to 5 hours long. And it just explores a whole decade. And yet it still didn't get them all. There's still a few that got away. But it's all about horror and all about the great icons of horror, talking about what it was like to make these films, to star in these films, to do the effects for these films, to eat the craft service on the tables of these films. And what's really cool is that the response to all of this was so wonderful from so many genuine horror fans that people wanted more. They're like, I could just watch these all day, more. Let's go into some other decades. And a lot of people said 70s, please do the 70s next. Yet many more people said do the 90s next. And because there was just an absolute cacophony, the drum beats were too loud for us. We were going to do In Search of Tomorrow Part 2, more 80s sci-fi, but we put that on hold because we're like, I think 90s horror really is in demand here. And we need to sort of catch the tiger by the tail while we can. And so that's why we're here. But what ultimately we're doing this time, different from the previous movies, which always go from 19 to the first year of the decade to the end of the decade, so 1980 to 1989. Instead, for the 90s, we're going to do a two-part documentary series where we go from 90 to 94 and then 95 to 99. And there's still going to be long-form documentaries, but ideally, this will give a little more stretching room in the film to get more within each year, because I'm always struggling to say, oh, I wish I had more time to do X, Y, or Z. I've also said, wouldn't it be cool if I could do television? And I want to include television this time around. Last, for the trilogy, we focused on film. There just wasn't room for any television whatsoever. But people did have questions about what about this and what about that? And so this time around, I want to incorporate some television as well. I mean, you've got everything from Stephen King miniseries like It and The Stand, or sometimes they come back, or even the Tommyknockers. But you also have X-Files, you also have Twin Peaks, you also have Tales from the Crypt, you have Are You Afraid of the Dark, and Erie, Indiana gateway horror that a lot of people love and want some sort of connection to, even in this film. And so this film really is about nostalgia, but the purpose of this film, other than to entertain and celebrate, is to remind people that there was just a huge amount of amazing material that went on in the 90s. And a lot of people kind of dismiss the 90s. Now, why do they dismiss it? I don't know. Some people are like, you're crazy. There's nothing to dismiss. It's great. But I think a lot of people in retrospect are like, there were too many slashers. The 80s sort of stole all the thunder. The 90s, nothing was really going on. Nothing was really happening until like Scream and, The Craft and I Know What You Did Last Summer or something like that, or, Blair Witch Project. But the thing is, this whole transition from late 80s to early 90s, it was a very difficult transition for horror, trying to find its footing and trying to cover new ground, yet still maintain the icons of the era, the villains of the era, the Freddys, the Jasons, the Pinheads, Chucky, and they all are in this first 4 years of the 90s and continuing on. But I think a lot of people forget that this period of time, which was very much the peak of the straight to video decade, everything, you go to Blockbuster, you go to the mom and pop shop and you'd go and find Full Moon, Troma, Roger Corman stuff, so much that it just bypassed the theater and it was right there on the shelf, and it was a whole different world. Yet there was and I know I'm doing lots of talking here, right?
Okay.
That's good. It's interesting.
The problem is there's so much going on, and I want to point out that this is a lost decade for some because they just don't seem to remember. But there was so much going on. I kind of feel like people almost dismissed a lot of the stuff because of nascent CGI and the baby steps of CGI in certain movies. Because 1993, Jurassic Park comes around and everyone says, I want that. I want something like that. But movies like Sleepwalkers, even the Stand miniseries, they're morphing. They're like, I saw Terminator 2. I want to do morphing. I want to do some morphing in my movie too,
Yeah.
And so I think because of the baby steps that were quite awkward with a brand new technology that didn't quite work so well as the amazing practical effects that we knew and loved, I think a lot of people dismissed a lot of great content and great swings for the fences that they had missed. And I think because that things were getting grittier and darker with everything from serial killer subgenres to producers saying, I want to make a horror film, but horror's kind of got a stigma to it. Why don't we call it a thriller, psychological thriller, erotic thriller, something like that? We're going to have a killer babysitter, but we'll just call it The Hand That Rocks the Cradle. We're going to single white female, is the roommate on the level? I don't know. She might be a stalker and, worse. But these are movies that are thrillers, arguably. Silence of the Lambs, a thriller, arguably. And so this definitely is a great, kickoff point for discussion.
Do you think in the 90s as well, I felt the studios decided that it would be great. Like they kind of, how am I trying to say this? They try to capture the magic of the 80s almost, but in a way of putting major stars in these movies. And there's a lot more bigger blockbuster type. Like you listed a bunch right there. And Silence of the Lambs wasn't that the first movie to win an Oscar? That was sort of in the horror genre. Like it just seemed like there was there's more movies with like bigger stars that were sort of the front of these movies, and they just seem to have more clout, I guess, than they had in the 80s. Like they sort of had more, they're shinier objects to play with. You know what I mean?
Well, I think you make a great point. Like talking about a time of transition, you had directors, John Carpenter, Joe Dante, David Cronenberg, who were either trying to continue with horror but try and find their place as to where it worked, or they were trying to get out of horror completely. But at the same time, you have, Tom Cruise says, "I'm going to be a vampire," and Interview with the Vampire, the great best-selling Anne Rice book. I want to do that.
Or Francis Ford Coppola did Dracula.
Yeah, and so what they do is they say, well, instead of just I'll do Dracula, I'll do it Bram Stoker's Dracula. So it feels more literary. It feels more worthy of Francis Ford Coppola. But you got Winona Ryder and Keanu Reeves. You've got Anthony Hopkins chewing up the scenery. Gary Oldman's bravura performance as Dracula. But then you've got Kenneth Branagh in the wings saying, I think I want to do Frankenstein. Well, we'll call it Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and we'll get Robert De Niro as the monster. It'll be great. Let's throw in Helena Bonham Carter, who looks great in any period piece. Just put her in a dress and you just go. Yeah. You don't even have to give her a script. Just stand there and you've got clout. Or Jack Nicholson is looking, he's sitting at the Laker game and he's just like, God, I've got an appetite and it's a full moon. Wait a minute. Wolf, yeah. I was talking to my kids the other day. I want to do this too. Let's get Michelle Pfeiffer and James Spader and turn this into something that is really, clever and interesting. And the identity of horror was not easy to pinpoint, and that's what makes this era so great. So you've got the straight to video movies that are arguably schlock, but it's our bread and butter on a Friday night. If you couldn't get Wolf or you couldn't get Bram Stoker's Dracula, you'd get Subspecies, or you get Puppet Master 3, or something like that. And not to be discounted, a lot of the straight to video stuff was like on the Full Moon Train, you'd have like Stuart Gordon doing The Pit and the Pendulum. He's still doing great stuff, and Full Moon is footing the bill, and you can find it on your shelf, and you're like, I don't know if I remember that being in the theater. Some people would have that disconnect. I had that disconnect where I was a bit of a snob because I was in my early 20s in the early 90s, and so I was like, well, if it wasn't in the theater, I'm not sure it's worthy of renting. But if the art was great, and if there was a promise of great gore and nudity, and you recognize a couple names, you're like, okay, I'll just put this, underneath Bram Stoker's Dracula. I will watch, But we have like Roger Corman's on Frankenstein Unbound as well. You could do a double feature with Shelley's Frankenstein.
I think too, for at least Larry and I, like the 80s were our high school years essentially. So we did a lot of renting of movies. We're out. But then by the time the 90s came, I was in college all of a sudden. And then your interests change, right? You're out and you're doing stuff. And, Lawrence or Larry's always at a kegger every week. And, it got wild in the 90s. But I found I watched a lot more in theater movies, I think, horror, than I did actually renting at that point.
Oh, okay.
We also would have had a bit more disposable income, because at that point, you're working your part-time jobs, and you've matured a little bit. So and I think as we matured, as the children of the 80s matured and went from the schlock of the 80s that was so awesome, and the physical effects and all of that stuff, we were getting more heady and more intellectual because we were all in college at that point.
Yeah.
Right. So, we needed our horror because we grew up with it. But we didn't necessarily need to see, balloons filled with blood, exploding in our faces. We wanted to see the psychological damage that it was causing to people. So, I think that's a lot of why we were seeing like Silence of the Lambs and Interview with the Vampire and things that were more heady, I mean,
I think I agree with you completely. I think that as I said, the directors were trying to sort of navigate this time and sort of, expand what they were doing. I think audiences as well, arguably, for the most part, were becoming more demanding of intellectually stimulating material with their horror. And while there was still plenty of just sort of, uh, uh, funny, comedic, over the top, bloody stuff like Dead Alive, Peter Jackson emerging and blowing us all away with this ridiculous film. Everyone's like, you gotta rent this. You had movies like, Jacob's Ladder, for example.
So good.
Rob Reiner, he wants to do a little horror as well, talking about the A-list and doing Misery, or even The Exorcist 3, something that no one had on their bingo card as being a good movie.
Yeah.
And it's a great film. It's a great film. Of course, it's a lot easier when you're coming off of Exorcist 2, The Heretic.
We both just watched it like last couple weeks or last week, and it's like Exorcist 2 is a bit of a mind like F on it, because it's just a bizarre movie.
We literally had to watch 3 to cleanse our palates. We're like, there's got to be something better here. You cannot kill this franchise with one movie. So,
well, it's easy to dunk on Exorcist 2, but I always like to say now that Joe Dante champions that movie as one of his favorites that he really likes. He kind of puts it in, like, no one likes to say guilty pleasure anymore, but he kind of puts that in his guilty pleasure quadrant. As a film that he thinks it's a well-made film, and it is what it is. But coming off of Friedkin's Exorcist, it's tough. It's tough. I mean, we're now 50 years later, from The Exorcist, and you've got Exorcist Believer, out, and William Friedkin probably would be very diplomatic or speak his mind about it if he were around. But speaking of William Friedkin, he did a movie in the early 90s called The Guardian. I don't know if you guys have heard about The Guardian. The Guardian's a good one, and that's like kind of about it's sort of like this omen. It's like a contemporary Los Angeles, if this works, a contemporary Los Angeles folk horror film about a nanny who is basically connected supernaturally to a tree, this sort of tree god, and wants to basically take this couple's baby and basically take it as hers, much like The Omen. This sort of mysterious nanny comes in and takes over the life of this family with nefarious intentions. And that's a Friedkin film that is definitely one to check out. That one didn't do well at the time because Friedkin's Exorcist was just so strong, and everything he had done around that time, up until Sorcerer, which is an amazing film, but stumbled badly at the box office because it was the year of Star Wars. Right, Friedkin never fully recovered after that. Live and Die in L.A. and Bug, and so many cool movies that he's done, but nothing quite resonated as like the 1-2 punch of French Connection and Exorcist and French Connection 2.
Are you finding now, venturing into the 90s, that, I mean, you were a child of the 80s. I mean, you grew up with the 80s horror. Are you finding a new love for the movies of the 90s? Did you now that you're going back to sort of capture the magic of the 90s, had you thought before this about how fantastic that decade was, or now that you've gone back through it, are you realizing, wow, it's better than I realized it was? Like, because you're calling it the lost decade, was it lost to you too?
It was lost to a certain degree. I saw a majority of the stuff that was there, but as I alluded to before, I was a bit of a snob. I was a film school snob, and a lot of the straight to video stuff I discounted, dismissed, or didn't see. And you know, there were select things. Listen, I have never been above anyone else other than above my own self and my own obstacle in terms of the enjoyment of this. But all I can say is in my later years, I grew to truly appreciate all the straight to video stuff. Whether it was art or schlock or anything in between, I could appreciate it for what it had to offer. But back then, I saw everything in the theater, no matter what. I mean, I'd be like, it's Friday night, I want to see a movie, Stephen King's Graveyard Shift. I know it'll probably not be very good, but I will just see it because it's Stephen King and it's Friday night. But there are so many movies that have been my absolute favorites ever since the 90s that I've come back to over and over and over again that to me are absolute classics. You know, Misery is one. Tom Savini's Night of the Living Dead remake is just absolutely superb. That's one that completely took me by surprise and is an annual spooky season view for me each and every year. Tremors, another movie. There's a certain threshold that I have when I want to go back to any film. Dead Alive is one of those. Is when I come in with just low expectations or no expectations, and I'm just pleasantly surprised because the movie it shouldn't be good, and it's really fun. You know, Exorcist 3, even Pet Sematary 2. You know, Pet Sematary 2 for me is like super fun. You know, Clancy Brown gives this amazing performance as this just obnoxious evil sheriff. Alive, then dead, then alive again. Spoiler.
Did you find you're speaking of sequels, like there was like maybe too many sequels in the 90s? Because there was a lot, because you had all the carryover from the 80s, like all of those franchises, plus you had brand new, you're getting into Leprechaun and all those type of movies, right, that have ones. But I looked at, I think it was 1994, you had Leprechaun 2, Night of the Demons 2, Pumpkinhead 2, The Birds, The Unborn 2. It just like never ended. It was just, everyone had a sequel.
Listen, I think it's great. Everyone loves these. Like, you know, I mean, I'm learning a lot in putting this together. One of the great things about putting these movies together is I get to talk to guys like you. I get to talk to the audience. We get to have a survey and people can fill out the survey. We do so much stuff on social media. You know, what's your favorite? What do you like? I'll do a poll. You know, like for example, you know, and I'm just thinking is I'm working in a vacuum of just my own tastes, unless I'm talking to the audience that's really like, how could you do this and not that? Like, for example, you know, talking about sequels, like there's Child's Play 2 and Child's Play 3. So I asked a very simple question, and I just said, if you had to choose one, which would you choose and why? And I figured it's probably going to be even, and I probably wouldn't learn much from it. Turns out Child's Play 2, way better in terms of fan appreciation than Child's Play 3. Not saying Child's Play 3 is a bad movie, but if you had to have one or the other, it was like a 90% to 10% choice for that. You know, and that is incredibly informative to me. I don't know, so many of these sequels, it is really fun when you are actually at the video store and you're just like, I'm in the mood for this. My comfort food is this character. You know, Leprechaun, Candyman. You know, did they do another Pennywise movie? Can I find it? You know, maybe they did. Oh, under P, there's Pumpkinhead 2. I guess I'll take that instead. You know, Tremors 2 through 7 through 25. You know, look, the more sequels, the better. You know, I think that's another problem with the 90s in terms of this quote unquote lost decade is that it was just sequelitis. You know, the franchises were just kept on going and kept on going. You know, Jason was around, except where does he go? He goes to hell. You know,
that's like one of my favorite Jason movies. It's so weird. I just love it.
You know, they killed off Freddy, but then 3 years later, he was brought back. You know,
New Nightmare.
Talking about you know, directors trying to, you know, figure out what they wanted to do next. I would argue that Wes Craven was at the peak of his game. You know, and so they kill off Freddy. Next thing that he does, he didn't do, you know, Freddy's Dead with the 3D glasses, but you know, it's his characters, it's his franchise, and ultimately he decides to do The People Under the Stairs, and then after that he goes back to Freddy 3 years after Freddie died, supposedly, and no one believed it. And reinvented him with New Nightmare. So he's basically like playing in this, the meta play, sandbox.
Yeah.
And have Robert Englund, Heather Langenkamp, Wes Craven himself, all playing themselves on screen, and Freddy's coming into their real life. Also, little Miko Hughes from Pet Sematary in that as well.
Yeah.
And so basically, that's sort of like the laying the groundwork for Scream. So he's Wes Craven is basically saying, how can I make horror movies interesting to me? Because we all know the template, the pattern, the formula at this point. How can we shake things up? Same thing with People Under the Stairs. He's like, I can make a socio-political commentary about urban blight, but let's make the most ridiculous, off the wall, insane, entertaining movie starring like a couple from Twin Peaks,
Yeah.
and Ving Rhames and going up against them, and it's just an outrageous movie, but it says a lot about the time. The times were a change in big time, because we're coming out of America's Reagan and Reaganomics and trickle down economics. We're not trickling down at all. The Rodney King beatings and then the LA riots. There was a lot going on, the Gulf War as well, which anyone paying attention, was a war about oil and not about right or wrong necessarily. I mean, we can go down that rabbit hole with Kuwait and unjustly taken by Iraq, but ultimately that's what people see. And so all this stuff is of course great horror reflects the times, and so you have Candyman, in the projects in Cabrini Green in Chicago, more of this sort of gritty urban blight, and that's sort of the playground of this area as well. But then you have, like, again, with this sort of serial killer subgenre that really is taking off after Silence of the Lambs, you've got Oliver Stone, who says, I'm going to do natural born killers, and I'm going to follow a pair of serial killers, but this is going to be a satire on reality television and the Jerry Springers and the Morton Downey Juniors of the world, and what shows will do now to get the best ratings possible, to the point where they're glorifying the violence, and Robert Downey Jr.'s reporter will go to any lengths and put his life on the line for the great ratings. It was a weird time.
Right. It was more reflective. I mean, the 80s, when you think back, I mean, it was just more sort of experimental. Like, how gross can we get? How out there can we be? But then they kind of dialed it back, I guess, in the 90s to make it more relatable to the times, I suppose, like you were saying. I mean, it really, when you express it like that, you really can see the difference between the decades. I mean, there was definitely a jump between the style of the 80s and the style of the 90s. So the evolution is quite apparent.
Much like the very, very, very colorful 80s, everything was very pop color, and everything got sort of dark, gray, gritty, flannel.
I love flannel.
And grungy, much like the back to basics of grunge. I think people were looking for new villains as well. There were plenty of supernatural, outrageous characters and creatures, but I think especially with Jeffrey Dahmer, not the first serial killer, but maybe the first serial killer to really capture the attention of so many people that really disturbed all of us, that someone could do such horrendous things and resort to cannibalism and so forth. And this is in your neighborhood, and the police were doing nothing. The police were, arguably, the neighbors were complaining and no one was doing a thing. That was more of the story that was going on. And then you have Silence of the Lambs drops, and everyone is now paying attention to serial killers. The whole subgenre of serial killers films comes out, but it's really about like wolves in sheep's clothing. Misery is like that too. You kind of have this woman who comes and helps you out. Turns out she's your ultimate number one fan, but she's a toxic fan, and she's going to kill you if you don't revive your character that her favorite character who was killed. But this whole subgenre of like serial killer movies, like you've got, and again with the A-listers, Brad Pitt, goes on a road trip with David Duchovny and Michelle Forbes in California with a K.
Yeah.
All this stuff was arguably thrillers about serial killers, dark and gritty. Go Jacob's Ladder. I always think is a great film that really kicks off that. It's early in the '90s, and it kicks off. Maybe that is the best sort of linchpin between the decades, because if you remember in the '80s, Vietnam and Vietnam films, and all about America's involvement in Vietnam, that was everywhere. From Oliver Stone with Platoon, Born on the 4th of July, and so on and so forth.
Full Metal Jacket, yeah.
Full Metal Jacket, Kubrick, and you have even all the missing in action movies with Chuck Norris. Everyone wanted to go and get the single-handedly Rambo, get the POWs and bring them back home. So in 1990, you've got Jacob's Ladder, which is, at first I remember seeing that in the theater. I'm just like, oh boy, it's another Vietnam film. I thought after Casualties of War with Michael J. Fox and Sean Penn, we weren't, Brian De Palma film, we weren't allowed to do those anymore, even though that's a good film. But it ties in very much to a whole story about our own government doing experiments on us, and about a guy who's just completely lost in time and space and experiencing the horror of not even knowing, A, not getting any help, not getting any assistance, and but B, not even knowing who he is or where he is or where he belongs. And I don't want to spoil that movie. You haven't seen it, but it's quite it throws you off. But it was incredibly stylized too. Adrian Lyne in that film.
It was almost like the '80s were an escape for us all. It was just fun to go to the movies. It was fun to escape into this really strange and grotesque world. But the '90s sort of came to terms with the real world and said, you know what, we have to actually face our problems and face the situation that's happening in the world and the situation that's happening politically and with our, the fallout of what's happened up to this point, and we're going to make that scary. That's scary in itself, so let's emphasize that. So it's still an escape going to the movie, but it's facing your real fears, as opposed to in the '80s where you're seeing all kinds of fearful things that you didn't even know existed.
Yeah, I think the '90s had a lot of more like things that could actually happen sort of movies, like Cape Fear, like Raising Cane's, Single White Female. Like these are things that could happen to you, as opposed to like something that's like a Freddy that's in your dreams, right? Like these are actual frightening situations that we read about now on the internet. Like, but then it's like, what, someone could actually take your identity, or like it was sort of like more frightening in that way. Again, though borderline on the thriller versus horror sort of section.
Yeah,
so.
But still scary.
and I think for that particular argument about is it horror, is it thriller, I think if this was happening to you in real life, you would be absolutely terrified.
Yeah.
And I think that's how it qualifies. And if you get a body count, then it solidifies it.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, in the '80s, if you see a killer clown coming down from outer space, you might be scared, but you'd probably more be just in disbelief, like what is happening here? But if you have a single white female situation, that would be terrifying. That would be life destroying.
The '90s were really the hangover, especially the early '90s. It was kind of like the big party of the '80s. The Greed is Good '80s, and then the hangover came, and I think pop culture was reflecting that quite a bit, and just trying to find its ground. But it's like people want to simplify with a definition when it's really kind of hard to do that. Why does a decade, a 10-year span, need to be summed up in a single sentence? And I think, if anything, that's what we're going to capture with this film, is that there was a lot going on, and that's a good thing. And much more than everyone potentially remembers, unless you were there. And even then, depending on who you were and how you are now, how old you are now, your mind was on other things anyway. My mind was on moving to California and going to Los Angeles and getting into movies. And it wasn't until like the LA, Jeffrey Dahmer on the news, or the O.J. Simpson slow speed Bronco chase did I like stop and pay attention to what was on the television. Otherwise, I was all about myself and my escape to the movies every Friday and Saturday, you know?
How
Or if I
important
was
is
working on movies and freelance, those killer matinees. I was the matinee.
Yeah, that's right.
Because I was either always working or not working at all.
Right.
How important was the TV side to this documentary? Because you're saying like this is the first time you've got like TV in there, and TV became like, I think like as the years have gone by, TV has gotten so much better. It's become more like way more ingrained in pop culture than I think it ever has. So, and this was, I think, the start of it, like really in the 90s, where you really started like they got away from the sitcom sort of idea and into these longer form sort of like you're saying, like the X-Files, which is such a different like concept than anything that had ever been on before.
Sure, I think so. I mean, well, you know, X-Files and we all know this if you do pay attention, you know, attention. I think X-Files was a great repackaging of everything from Twilight Zone and Outer Limits to Kolchak the Night Stalker, and have, you know, and Project Blue Book, you know.
Yeah. Loop and I were just talking about Monsters. I don't know if you remember Monsters.
Yeah. Monsters, exactly.
That was another one.
The family with you got the you have a third eye or only one eye?
One eye. They were all Cyclops. I don't know what the plural is for Cyclops.
They were yes.
Encyclopedia. Yes, this is a family of encyclopedia.
Held by the plural of Cyclops.
But I mean, and that was the thing, is that we did, like, when you couldn't rent a movie because you were too young to go out and rent one, you couldn't go to the theater to go see a movie because you were too young to go by yourself. There's
a huge amount, and I think what's interesting is you look at the Stephen King miniseries. People were starting to realize after Stephen King was a box office king and then starting to become box office poison. You know, Pet Sematary did really well, but Pet Sematary they weren't going to make because Stephen King's name wasn't doing so well. You know, with a lot of it, you know, everyone got to do a Stephen King film, and so they weren't so good. A lot of them, and a lot of them were great. So that being said, I think people looked at these 1,000-page books and said, you know what, maybe we shouldn't like chop most of it out and do a 2-hour film. Why don't we do a miniseries? You know, The Stand, which is my favorite Stephen King book of all time.
That's great.
Absolutely amazing miniseries from Mick Garris. I think it would arguably be among the gateway television that people can definitely look to that and say, you know, Pennywise infiltrated my dreams and absolutely scared me. It's sort of the groundwork, not like the 80s was the original one to do it, because the miniseries came way before the 80s. But I think that those miniseries, like say those Stephen King miniseries, for example, and don't forget Salem's Lot was a TV movie, 219.
Yeah.
Much of the series and limited series horror that we get to see on TV now, I think that stuff was part of the groundwork to show that people would really respond to this on the small screen television. Now the not so small screen television in your living room, you know. It gives you flexibility to tell a better story, and that's why I love so much of the horror today. That is on television as series, and everything from Stranger Things on, because they take the time to tell a really good tale and flesh out the characters. So when they are ripped limb from limb, you care about them, you know?
And speaking of good stories and telling good stories, this year you've got, so associated with the new doc, you've got a year-long celebration of your documentary. So what's new this year? What can people anticipate, and how can they participate?
Yeah, well, what we love to do, I was talking about how we love to ingratiate everyone's thoughts and their ideas and their opinions by way of survey and comments on social media and so on and so forth. I pay attention to all that stuff. I take copious notes. And what's cool about it is that we're doing right now, between now and October 31st, go to 90shorrordoc.com, and you can reserve your copy of In Search of Darkness 1990 to 1994. Get your name in the credits, get lots of cool swag. If you go to the site, you can see all that stuff. But it's not like you order it and then you forget about it, and then one day you're like, oh yeah, that. We want to engage everyone for a calendar year with all sorts of cool stuff. And it's all listed if you go to 90shorrordoc.com. But we're going to do live events with, Q&As with horror icons, and just discussions like we're having now about very specific topics, and just nerding out about why we love horror very specifically with topics. But some of the faces that you know and love, that you guys can pick their brains as well, and just some transparent Q&As with us as the filmmakers. When we have many people that we will be announcing who will be in this, and we can't wait to do it. And when we do, you guys will be the first to know, that kind of stuff. Reason why we can't talk about anyone who's in the documentary right now is because we're still currently, unfortunately, in the SAG-AFTRA strike. And we're completely supportive of that and in solidarity with that. We just won't announce anybody. But we have never been, we're always shameless about shouting from the rooftops of all the amazing people that we get. And so, and if our track record for the In Search of Darkness trilogy of the 80s movies is any, watermark of what we're trying to do, it'll be the same for the 90s. And that we'll have to leave that one at
that. Perfect.
Well, it's all exciting. It's all exciting.
So again, how do people get this doc? Like I already went on today and I did it. So it's simple. If anyone who's going to do it, it's really easy to do. And you said it's going to come out, I think it says next year.
Yeah. Everything is tentative because the strike is happening still. So this film is in pre-production, and we're essentially on hold, and we have to wait for the strike to end before we can do our interviews. So I am hoping that 5 minutes from now it's going to be done, and I've got my work cut out for me, and I cannot wait to dive into it. But the idea is it's done and ready in a year, and everyone would get it in their hands by December or the beginning of the following year. That's usually how we do it. Based on manufacturing and all that kind of stuff like that. But I don't like to make promises I can't keep, So, but if our track, again, going back to our track record, we have a campaign. A year later, you get your movie each and every time, and so it's the plan with this as well.
Well, I can't believe how long ago like the first time you're on was like 3 or 4 years ago, and already you've done 4 movies since then, since we've talked to you. You're on your 5th, and then there's also like a side like Aliens movie, right? That's being produced, and it's like you're obviously doing well. You've got you know what you're doing. So, and the ones that you've done, and like the praise is incredible for them all. They're so good. Like honestly, if you've never seen any of your stuff, like you've got to run right now and see it somehow. And they're just so awesome. Like all of them are.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Well, plus I have that cable knit sweater business where I knit them myself.
I forgot about that. Yeah.
Side gig. It's so important.
I pre-ordered mine already, so I can't wait to get
it. I don't know. That was arbitrary, but it came to me. There is no cable knit company that I do myself.
Well, I got to tell you, your doc is still a record for me, having sat for 5 continuous hours and watched one thing on my computer screen. It hasn't happened before, hasn't happened since. I can't imagine again. That's how good these docs are. They really, I mean, we don't have you on just to fill an episode. We have you on because we are 100% behind what you're doing.
And you're not mentioning that extra hour it took to extricate you from the chair, right?
Oh yeah, no, that was the 6th hour. That was the 6th hour. We don't
My entire body fell asleep, and I could not call for help.
I had to go over there with a forklift and some oil. I did my best. I did my best to get him off that chair. But...
It was awful. But the 5 hours before that were awesome. but truly, I mean, it's such a nostalgia trip. You really do hit on all of the memories that we all share, and they really are. I mean, like you said, there may be a couple of things that haven't made the cut, but really you don't even think about those things because what's there are the big moments, right? They're the ones that mean the most to us.
Everyone should at the very least check out the trailer. It's a killer trailer.
Yeah,
it's going to do everything that it took me this whole hour to talk about, which is remind you that there was so much great shit in the 1990 to 1994 stretch alone.
Yes.
So much good stuff, so much stuff that you had never even seen before, so much stuff that you're like, oh yeah, that. And like so many titles, I mean, we haven't talked about Arachnophobia. We haven't talked about The Witches. We haven't talked about the Gremlins 2. We haven't talked about Popcorn. We haven't talked about Addams Family. You know,
Body
we haven't
bags.
talked about Delicatessen, the French movie Delicatessen. We haven't
Yeah.
talked about Innocent Blood. You know, I remember seeing Innocent Blood, and I'm like, John Landis is going to do vampires now. I got to go see it. Wait, this is a gangster movie? But wait, it's got Anne Perlot, and she's completely naked. This is actually.
Yeah.
We haven't talked about Dr. Giggles, who I think about every time I go to the dentist. And the
Yes.
doctor. Sorry, there's the dentist with Corbin Burnson. I was one step ahead of my own joke.
Yeah, there is just so much, and you do such a great job of incorporating all of this, or at least having mentions of all of it. And all it takes is a mention, and that's like you said, that the trailer. I mean, Loop and I have watched the trailer dozens of times already, and it's because you pack in, what is it, 4.5 minutes, just over 4
Yeah,
minutes.
yeah. I think we dropped in 88 movies in that time.
It's crazy. It's crazy, and you're right. I mean, there were. Every time something would pop up, I'm like, oh right, that was the 90s. I'd forgotten about that. So I mean, yeah, until the doc comes out, spend your days watching this doc, or watching this trailer, because
Yeah.
just the snippets of all of these films is just will bring joy to your soul.
I'm gonna listicle things that just are so great that we haven't even done, talked about. We didn't even mention in this conversation In the Mouth of Madness. We didn't talk about Amityville, A New Generation. I'm kidding,
Yeah.
but it does follow.
There was a reason for that. Yeah.
Hocus Pocus, Needful Things, The Nightmare Before Christmas.
Did we talk Addams Family yet? That came out, right?
Addams Family Values, right? Because there's and I think even like the Addams Family Values, that title goes over everyone's heads now. I think because that was so of its time, because there was the whole presidential campaign with George Bush and oh my gosh, see, he's so forgettable. Quayle, Dan Quayle.
Oh, Dan Quayle.
Oh, Dan Quayle. Wow.
They were always talking about family values, and
yes,
and it was such a thing in the zeitgeist that they literally called Addams Family Values to talk about how an unconventional family could have their own family values that are as good as the ones that might not fit the norm of these family values that you're proclaiming are what we should go back to,
and that pretty much holds for the whole genre of horror, right? I mean, the genre of horror holds values in it that may not appeal to people, or people might not recognize, but they're just as valuable and they're just as good, and they give you the same, they fulfill the needs that that a lot of people have without you even realizing it. It's just
absolutely yeah. I mean, like how could a movie like Basket Case 2 be about finding family? But it is, I mean,
it is.
It's true. Yeah, it's so great. I'm so excited to see this thing. I think it's going to be great. And the one thing that I just want to sort of wrap with is, if you haven't followed their social media pages, get on the social media, the Facebooks and the Instagrams, because you're constantly populating your social media with new information and the trailers and bits of things, just teasers, and like that's really your ability to build the buzz is fantastic, and that's what's going to keep us going for the next year until we get the doc in our hand, because it's fun to watch.
That's very much part of the engagement. Yeah, at 80s horror doc. We did not change it to 90s horror doc, because then we'd have 3 people who were like, "Oh, I found you."
Yes.
So, but if you look at 80s horror doc on Facebook, on Instagram, on Twitter/X, and I think we have a foothold on TikTok. I always say that, but then I could be lying. I don't know. But shout out to Carla Hampton, who she does the majority of our social media, and she's great and inventive, and always does these verses. It's like Pennywise versus Candyman. Who would win? that kind of stuff like that, and keeps it very fun, and I think community is incredibly important to us. A non-toxic community who just loves this stuff for the sake of loving it.
Yeah.
And that's very much that is weaved into the formula of these In Search of Darkness movies, is the absolute celebration of this era, and everything being on an even playing field. And I can't wait to do the exact same thing to so much of the stuff that we've been talking about for the 90s.
I just wanted to give a quick shout out to the artists who creates your posters as well.
Oh yeah.
Oh
Dave
God,
Weiner.
yes.
I love these things. Like, these are some of the greatest movie posters that are out there. I mean, so please just give us a little insight into who that is.
Yeah, Dave Morrell, I believe you're talking about. We have two artists who do our art. Clayton Benj is our in-house art director, and he does all if you see it, he did it. That's a very broad way of saying he does so much. Yeah. But he does, like, for the posters, he does the one where it's like the kid in front of the television, and or the giant Roman numerals, that kind of stuff like that. Dave Morrell takes Robin Block is our executive producer. He owns Creator VC. He's incredibly creative, and he loves to take an idea and turn it into reality, whether it's a poster or whether it's a movie or whether it's a media platform. Whatever it is, he wants to create great stuff that's community driven entertainment. When it comes to the posters, he's just like, all right, we're going to a brand new decade. He's like, what am I going to do? What do I do? What do I do? But he was really kind of caught up with this lost decade concept. He's like, this kind of is a cool little hook. How about a maze? You're kind of lost in the labyrinth of VHS.
It looks so cool.
Yeah. And so he'll art direct with Dave Morrell, who's an incredibly talented artist. He's been with us since In Search of Darkness 2, where he did kind of the Kelly Maroney Rebels zombie cheerleader, with all these hands coming out and getting you. And then we did a whole thing where we had kind of we called him the curator, but he's sort of our host, sort of like this crypt keeper style skeleton who's hosting, and he's basically digging. This is In Search of Darkness 3. He's digging into the grave to dig up all the stuff that we haven't dug up yet for In Search of Darkness 3 from the 80s. And so this time around, we're going, stepping into a whole new decade. So we're stepping into this labyrinth that you probably don't want to go in alone.
It's great. And if you order the doc, if you order the proper package or one of the package, you get at least 2 or 3 of these posters.
Yeah, you get the 2 posters I described, the kid in front of the TV with all the new 90s people, and you get the Dave Morrell poster, suitable for framing. Really cool stuff. You get a digital copy of the movie, you get the physical copy of the movie. Something I haven't mentioned, because there's always too many things to mention, is that In Search of Darkness, the trilogy, if you never got your physical copy, you can now order that as well during this campaign, and only until Halloween. You got to jump on it. You can get the trilogy in one disc. So basically, like one single disc with the flaps, so you've got all 3 individual discs. It's going to have new art. It's going to have a new booklet. But for like, people were like, oh, I'm going to catch up, get some ideas for spooky season and watch In Search of Darkness on Shudder and, Amazon and AMC Plus. Where the heck is In Search of Darkness 1? 2 and 3 is there, but 1 has mysteriously disappeared, killed by an unnamed villain. But so the thing is, all the people like you guys are like, I'm not worried. I have my physical copy on my shelf. And, streaming is temporary, but physical is forever. And so what's cool about this is, if you want to get the In Search of Darkness trilogy, the 80s trilogy, you can order that now, and that's going to come to you by Christmas. That's going to be turned right around. So another cool thing that you could do, independent of In Search of Darkness 90s.
Do it.
Yeah, definitely get it. And David, we've taken up so much of your time. Thank you so much for being on again. You're just like a wealth of information, and you've created these, essentially walking into a library of of horror and like everything we'd ever want to know is right in there. So I love what you've done, and you just continue to do it. And get out there and order these. If you haven't got the 80s, get it. If you get this 90s one, and you're gonna enjoy it. Anyone that hasn't seen it yet is like you must. It's a must see, in my opinion, if you like horror at all. So thank you so much.
Have to step in really quick. And so Larry is, I don't know what that is behind you, but it's reminding me of the balloon from It. But
That's exactly what it is.
Is that what it is? Okay.
It is literally the balloon, and it lights up, but I don't have an outlet close enough to me that I can let, but it does light up. Yes, I put it there.
That or a punching bag. I couldn't.
It is literally a balloon. So you can see the balloon.
Oh, there you go. It is. All right. Yeah. It literally is.
Yeah, it's an on-off switch. No, it's I had to represent the the Pennywise here. I also have a Pennywise. I also have Pennywise sitting next to me. I'm a bit of a Pennywise fanatic over here.
Very cool. Well, Larry, I have to tell you, I think you were swindled. That's actually a collectible from The Red Balloon, the French short film.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
Is that why it was on deep discount?
So embarrassing.
This is so cheap, this thing.
And Mr. Loop, I see you have your Return of the Living Dead shirt.
I do.
Very, very cool. So you now have, in the 90s, you've got Return of the Living Dead Part 3.
That's right.
Which
yeah.
Brian Yuzna directed, and you've got an insane, amazing zombie in that one that everyone loves. And so that's a favorite as well. So there's so much good stuff.
We love our horror.
Yeah, we do. We really do. Well, thank you so much, David, once again.
Yeah,
absolutely. It's always a pleasure. And you guys enjoy the rest of your spooky season.
Thank you. We can't wait for your 7th appearance.
Larry, I can't believe he was back.
Sixth time. I want to say 6th time is the charm, but there's going to be a 7th and probably an 8th and a 9th. So
he's been on every season we've done.
It's exactly. We're going to keep going.
and no less interesting every time. Like I just love listening to his stories, and he's just met so many people in the industry, and it's just so cool to have him on.
Yeah, and once again, if you have not ordered the 80s doc, get it now. You've got until October 31st to get the complete trilogy, and then put your name down and put your order in for the 90s doc, because truly these things are spectacular. You've never seen documentaries like these before. If you're a horror fan, even in the slightest, you'll love it.
Yeah, we had to wait 3 years to get all 3 of ours. You can do it in within a month,
yes.
and get it by the end of the year. So it's like,
that's right.
We had a lot of anticipation. You just order it. Just go and order it. Don't get it.
Yeah, you don't have to wait like we did.
Well, thank you everybody for joining us again. Check us out on our socials because we're always posting.
Always
Not as much as In Search of Darkness does, but we're getting there. We're getting there.
Yeah, we'll get there.
But thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Loop and Larry, Guardians of Geek.
Bye.
Produced by Matthew C. Loop and Lawrence Simner. A Loop and Larry production.
Bueller.
He likes it. Hey, Mikey.
Bueller.
Bad news. Fog is getting thicker.
And Leon's getting larger.
Inconceivable.
Brian's right. It's an elf.
Wax on.
Does Barry Manilow know that you raid his wardrobe?
Oh, Captain, my captain.
Life moves pretty fast. You don't stop and look around once in a while, you could miss it.
Wax off.